Hello and welcome to this GCSE guide to Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. Today we're going to focus on Chapter 7, Incident at the Window.
What is this feeling of power and drive I've never known? I feel alive. Where does this feeling of power derive, making me know why I'm alive? Like the night, it's a secret, sinister, dark, and unknown. I do not know what I seek, yet I'll seek it alone. I have a thirst that I cannot deprive. Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive. Like the moon, an enigma, lost and alone in the night. Damned by some heavenly stigma, but blazing with light. It's the feeling of being alive, filled with evil but truly alive. It's a truth that cannot be denied. It's a feeling of being inward high.
As you can see on the screen then, here's our user's guide. Please pause the video if you haven't done one of these videos before to see how best to use this resource for your revision studies / note making. We're going to look at, as normal, the 3 assessment criteria or assessment objectives. That is AO1, understand what the book is about, AO2, its language, form and structure, and AO3, its context. We're going to look at each of the key themes that relate to this chapter and explore these in a bit more depth. These are all the key themes you could be asked about in the test. So, Chapter 7. What does Stevenson want us to remember about Chapter 7? Well, this is when it's hinted to Utterson that Jekyll turns into Hyde. Utterson begins to realise perhaps the horrible truth at this point. What does Stevenson tell us about Jekyll and Hyde here? Well, we've got Jekyll being now described as poor, suffering from infinite sadness, being a disconsolate prisoner, and feeling very low. Stevenson gives Jekyll the impression that he is a recovering addict, describing him as a prisoner who is poor and very low. Jekyll is now struggling to contain his addiction to sin, and it's taking its toll on him emotionally. Stevenson clearly implies that Jekyll is depressed. A summary then of Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Utterson and Enfield are on one of their walks when they pass by Jekyll's house, and coincidentally see him sticking his head out of the window getting some fresh air. Jekyll looks extremely sick, so they invite him on a walk, which they think could help. However, all of a sudden, Jekyll gets this horrified look on his face, quickly closes the window, and runs deeper into the house. Shocked and confused, Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield leave.
Chapter 7 then, what do we learn from this chapter? Utterson and Enfield go for a walk once again, just like they did at the beginning of the book. They see Jekyll and invite him to go out with them. Jekyll agrees, but then freezes and disappears back inside the house. Utterson and Enfield walk on in silence, scared to admit what they might have just seen.
In Chapter 7 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one Sunday, Utterson and Enfield go for a walk. As they pass the mysterious door Hyde went into in the first chapter, the conversation turns to Hyde. Enfield suggests they'll never see him again. Both men explain how meeting Hyde filled them with revulsion. Enfield then admits he feels foolish for not knowing that the door led to Jekyll's home. Utterson says he's worried about Jekyll and suggests they step into the courtyard. From there, they view Jekyll sitting at a window. They invite him out, and since he looks unhealthy, suggest that being outside will be good for his health. Jekyll turns them down, saying it is impossible for him to come out just then. Nevertheless, they agree to talk where they are. Suddenly, however, Jekyll looks terrified. The window slams shut, and he disappears without a word. His friends walk away, silent for a time, but very disturbed.
Now we're going to look at key extracts from this chapter and then analysing those as if they were extracts you would have in the actual exam. You can see down the right hand side some key phrases to use when analysing an extract or indeed the novel. Stevenson presents us with Enfield as satisfied that the story of Hyde has ended, which implies that most of London has begun to forget about Hyde. It is Utterson's addiction to the mystery that keeps feeding him and wants him to probe deeper. Stevenson makes it appear that Utterson's knowledge makes others look foolish or ill-prepared. The sudden informality Enfield uses here almost appears rude and vulgar in the face of Utterson's formal language so far. Stevenson links back to the idea of the house being personified and now wants us to look in the windows. The windows are said to be the gateway to the soul. Stevenson contrasts the outside of Jekyll with the inner man he really is. Friendship will support Jekyll's outer mannerisms. In other words, Utterson and Enfield can support Jekyll in appearing social, but Utterson seeks more than this and wants to peer deep inside of Jekyll and indeed his house. Stevenson challenges us to think of this as a nightmare, as if the good Jekyll has suddenly scared to death by an unseen force. Stevenson keeps the actual vision a secret as he simply repeats glimpse and lets our own imagination do the rest. He wants us to imagine what happened to Jekyll rather than describing it. Both Utterson and Enfield retreat back to civilization before they feel at ease. The phrase stirrings of life contrasts with the death-like adjectives earlier, froze and abject terror. Now let's look at the key themes in Jekyll and Hyde in this chapter. First of all then we look at setting. In this chapter we're brought back to where the novella began. Yet Utterson is no longer satisfied with standing outside. He wants to take a look at the windows, and full of premature twilight, although sky was still bright. So the house itself is in darkness, whereas everything around it still is illuminated by the sun. Stevenson omits his Gothic description of the house, instead forcing us to reflect on the eyes of the house and the balance between light and dark here. He deliberately casts the house in shadow at the end of the day and contrasts this with the bright sunset of hope and romance that the rest of London can see. This foreshadows the end of Jekyll's life and the continuation of Utterson and Enfield's own story. The theme of friendship. It was impossible to do the one thing without the other, returned Enfield. And by the way, what an arse he must have thought me not to know that this is the back way to Dr. Jekyll's. Stevens suggests the friendship here is breaking down due to Hyde's influence in this chapter. Enfield appears offended by Utterson's lack of openness and breaks the rule of friendship, that of politeness and respect. What an arse you must have thought me, which infers the breakdown of society's interaction due to the persistent nature of Hyde inside each of the characters. As I've said in previous recordings, Hyde is like a negative influence on all the characters, like an insidious force or indeed some kind of virus that's slowly creeping into society. Utterson's response here appears aloof and ego-driven before he also voices a concern about Jekyll and steps inside the inner area of Jekyll's walls. Stevens subtly reveals the depth to which Hyde's behaviour has begun to affect Utterson, with several links that appear almost out of character, yet he also presents Utterson as a man who still thinks of himself as a power for good. The presence of a friend might do him good, implying that Utterson still believes he can save his friend Jekyll from damnation, even though he is now succumbing to a lower moral standard. The theme of violence. In this chapter, we see violence is shown with Stevenson's use of verbs, struck and thrust. These both imply a sense of panic that Jekyll feels as he transforms, and the jerky, uncontrolled reactions that imply he can no longer control or contain Hyde. These actions give us a sense that Jekyll's inner battle is showing on his outer self, much like an addict would to control an addiction. Now, we need to think quite closely about Jekyll's sudden change, and this could further imply his addiction to being Hyde. How many of the following symptoms could apply to Jekyll at this point in the novella? You can see some listed in the background at the moment. And here are a couple of others in the porn video clips.
So the two key telltale signs of addiction or drug abuse are physical and emotional. So physically, you notice that there are profound changes in the person. Changes in the way that they dress, changes in the way that they take care of themselves. Physical changes, there could be changes in their body weight. They could either be gaining a lot of weight or losing a lot of weight. And emotionally, you want to look at their behavior. You want to look at mood swings. Are they experiencing really high highs and really low lows? Also, you want to look at irritability. Is the person really irritable? Are they defensive? Are they, if you bring up the topic of drug addiction or drug use, do they get incredibly defensive about it? So those two things are the key factors that you should be looking for. These physical changes and these emotional reactions and these emotional changes in the person.
Know the signs of drug abuse: dilated or constricted pupils, sudden changes in social network, increased aggression or irritability, weight loss, changes in habits, financial problems, legal issues, loss of interest, and depression.
So tick those off one after the other. How many of those actually fit the description of Jekyll at this point? But also how many of them could actually be linked to someone like Utterson? That might give you some interesting exploration to go further with through your own studies. The theme of religion. Clearly in this chapter then we have God forgive us, being uttered by both Utterson and Enfield at the end of the chapter. The name of God is once again uttered in repentance. Now Stevenson is following the same formula. When a situation is deemed out of scientific or a character's control, they turn to God for support. This fits with Stevenson's own belief that science is powerful and a force for progress, yet ultimately God is the most powerful and the one person who can truly forgive. There are another two times that a similar technique is used. We have chapter 5 where Jekyll says I swear to God twice, and Lanyon in chapter 6 for God's sake, in God's name. Now Stevenson repeatedly mentions the name of God twice each time he's mentioned. Stevenson appears to frequently undermine the character's belief in God through his use of repetition. The word God is often needed to be repeated by a character with some insistence or shouting, which further reminds us that perhaps God isn't listening and the character's cries for help are not being listened to. Here's some key quotes from this chapter then that you could explore in more depth. What does Stevenson want us to think of at the end of this chapter? Stevenson creates a sense of panic as we see for the first time just how close to the surface the inner violence is in Jekyll and indeed all of us. As you can see then, this screen's got 3 key quotes and you're just about to see some grade 5 examples for each one. So my paragraph would begin with, as the novella develops, Stevenson foreshadows Jekyll's death. And here are my grade 5 answers. Let's move on then to essay skills, where we think about the ideas we've covered in today's video and how those might be translated into an essay. Today's question, how is the theme of horror explored in Jekyll and Hyde? And obviously in this case, horror can easily be substituted by the word violence, so you'll be looking at your violence notes to help you answer this question. Here then is our question on the left-hand side, theme of horror, and the extract that's selected is on the right-hand side. This is a little bit shorter than the one you'd have in the test, and as you listen to this video, to this recording of it, please think about which quotes you'd select from this extract that you think best fits the question asked.
That is just what I was about to venture to propose,
returned the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck out of his face, and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the 2 gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down, but that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it was not until they had come into a neighbouring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes.
"God forgive us! God forgive us!"
said Mr. Utterson, but Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously and walked on once more in silence.
As I now look at this extract then, I've highlighted my quotes I'm going to use in red and green. The green ones are going to be the ones I look at in more detail, and the red ones I'm going to use point, evidence, explain with, just to make sure I've got more quotes in my response. So this is one response that I could use then to this extract. As you can see, I've got my response on the right hand side there, and the level criteria on the bottom, and this is a level 1 response. Utterson and Enfield are shocked at what they saw in Jekyll. The quote, "smile was stuck," used alliteration, and it's obvious that Jekyll is hit in the face by Hyde. "'Tis make us feel horrified, then Jekyll looks bad, abject terror and despair, implying that he's scared. Utterson runs away and is horrified and wants to help from God." You can see each quote explanation is really, really short. There are errors being used there that makes the meaning unclear. And you can see there isn't really any further thought there. There's no because. It doesn't really mention, it mentions the reader once, but really this is a really short response, and so would only achieve something like a grade 2 at the most, even though it has got a couple of quotes used there. There's certainly no analysis. Here's my second response then. This is more like my high grade 4 or grade 5. As the book continues, the theme of horror becomes more personal. Jekyll is now a prisoner that hides in the house. My first quote there is embedded in a sentence. He can hardly stop Hyde and is trying to hold himself together. So although there isn't a because there, at least I've tried to explain exactly how Jekyll's feeling linked to the theme of horror. Utterson and Enfield see him, but the smile was struck out of his face, which suggests he's still fighting Hyde on the inside. The word struck implies that Hyde is being violent and aggressive in his battle against Jekyll. This is horrifying as the very blood of the two gentlemen froze, which makes us imagine how horrifying the scene must be. They then leave, when they leave, neither man can get rid of what they saw and repeated, "God forgive us," as they know they've seen the impossible and are scared. This means that they turn to God when they don't know what to do. We've got basic exploration here. The candidate is clearly explaining his points linked to quotes. I've got a bit of analysis looking at the word struck in detail there, and I've gone on to try and explain how the quotes linked together as the extract progresses. But then only a level 3 on the grade criteria, or around about a grade 4, maybe just about scraping a low grade 5 if I was turning it into an exam response. And lastly then, my level 5 answer, or my grade 7 or better response. As the novella develops, Stevenson explores the complicated relationship between Jekyll and Hyde as the two struggle for control of Jekyll's soul. The novel continues as it began. As you can see, I've clearly linked there to where the extract fits in with the novella as a whole, and thought about how I might use this. As it began with U and E making their way into Jekyll's court to resolve the mystery, and at first they see their friend as at ease and try and help him. That shows an understanding of the extract as a whole and where it fits in with the novella. Stevenson, notice I keep mentioning the author's name. These events are not real, so it's important to recognise that in the fact that it's Stevenson or the writer creating this particular sense of horror in this extract. Stevenson confronts us with violent verbs such as struck and thrust, which force us to witness the violence that still boils under Jekyll's calm surface. Notice I'm just using the notes that I made from earlier on in the clip. Stevenson describes Jekyll as feeling terror at being found out, and despair as he knows that it's a battle he will lose. Notice I'll focus on individual words in the extract there and go on to link them together, forming groups of quotes that actually create the same effect. The effect of the horror on the observers is equally chilling as it froze the very blood, implying that the realization that their respected friend was in fact a monster and killer who is so shocking that it affects both men to their core. So I'm looking at the characters' reactions there as well as the readers. The scientific terminology of blood implies that that their thoughts on how man is structured and now have been altered due to Jekyll's scientific balderdash. Notice I'm using there a quote and linking to this idea of blood being linked to sort of DNA and the structure of man, and linking that to a previous quote from the book, Scientific Balderdash. Both men react by turning their backs on science. God forgive us. It's said twice to imply that what they saw is so horrific that science and reason can no longer help them. Now that shows me exploring the text. I'm thinking about the themes and how Stevenson is showing those themes in the wording he's using. The phrase is repeated, which confronts us with the idea that God is no longer listening or doesn't care for the lives of men who have turned from a religious path. So there, I'm definitely evaluating the text. I'm thinking about what the writer's trying to do. I'm looking at language effects there, as well as the effects created by the repetition, and I'm beginning to use a bit of subject terminology, but not too much as to ruin the answer. I've just used things like repetition in that response, just used when I noticed them. And lastly, a short understanding between the book and the time it was written. You can see that I've got my links to science and religion there, linking to the Victorian world the novel is set in. Here then is an extract from a little bit later in the novella. This is from chapter 8. Now, as you listen to this recording or this audio version of this extract, think about which quotes you'd now use to link to the theme of horror, which ones might be the ones you'd want to zoom in on or explore in more detail, and which ones you could link to AO3 or the context.
Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and fire, the things laid out for tea. The quietest room, you would have said, and, but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace that night in London. Right in the middle there lay the body of a man sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe.
Okay, now you've listened to that extract, look at the grey criteria at the bottom there. Think which quotes you'd want to use, which ones you could explore, and equally what precise subject terminology could you apply to this extract to give you an exam response. Thank you then for listening to this guide to Jekyll and Hyde as a revision study.